It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege to interview the podcast of All Women's Sports Matters podcast from the host, Lindsay Smith. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to start a sports podcast talking about women's sports?
Yeah, so my podcast name is All Women's Sports. I had changed it, and it really took me a while to come up with this idea. I always knew I wanted to start a podcast, and of course, I thought of this while we were in quarantine. But it took me forever, and it didn't dawn on me that I wanted to do it about women until after I finished one of my college classes. And then when I started pay attention to the NWSL, the WNBA, I realized on networks like ESPN, Fox Sports, CBS Sports, that those leagues and any other leagues were not being talked about enough or not being addressed at all. So I was like, okay, I need to do something about women's sports to catch people's attention, saying, don't just pay attention to male athletes like in the NFL, NBA. There are some pretty good women athletes that deserve the same attention that the NFL, NBA, MLB get.
How did you come up with the name of your podcast?
Well, I wanted my name to be really straightforward so people knew what I was talking about. And as people know, if they've been following me since last year, I kind of rebranded my podcast. And I was like, okay, I'm going to change it off. I'm going to change the name. What would be better? And then I thought all women's sports, so they know I'm talking anything and everything about women's leagues and athletes.
Who are some of the people that you have interviewed?
So just a few weeks ago, I interviewed Becky Morgan, who's a writer. I forgot who she writes for, but she covers Racing Louisville of the NWSL, and we talked about Racing Louisville season. We talked about the NWSL controversy that's going on right now. And so I really encourage anyone that sees our video, to go listen, because what's going on with the NWSL right now is unacceptable, and you should go and see so you understand what I'm saying.
What are some of your favorite topics that you have covered so far?
I really love covering the games of the leagues that are in season right now. As many of my followers know, right now I'm focusing on the NWSL. But when the WNBA, the Professional Hockey League, is that the Women's Hockey League?
Yes, the PFF.
The PSF, when they start their season, I will talk about them. I'm just focusing on the teams that are in season. And of course, everyone knows the NWSL season will end next month.
Of course, when it comes to obviously covering the NWSL, the WNBA, and the NWHL/PHF, Are you planning on interviewing professional athletes from that particular leagues, such as obviously those leagues?
Yes, of course. I think it's important. So fun fact, I had actually not really heard about the NWSL till about a year ago. My favorite player of the Chicago Red Stars, Kalia Watt, had gotten engaged, and I was so confused on what team she was on. I I didn't know the Chicago Red Stars were the NWSL team. So when I saw it, I first panicked that her husband was being traded. But then I looked it up and I then I just started watching it. And one thing I reference in my podcast a lot is that I was a former soccer player myself. So when I found out about the league and I started watching it, I started falling in love with soccer again. And now, if I miss any NWSL game and WNBA, I get in a bad mood because I want to watch it.
Who are some of your future potential interviews that you plan on having on?
So, I'm really hoping to get Kalia Watt, um, obviously, because I just mentioned her and I reference her and her husband a few times in my episodes. I'm really hoping to get Gotham's FC's new head coach, Scott Parkinson, on because he was the former assistant coach of the Chicago Red Stars. And one thing I've really been thinking about is, since I am talking about women's sports, I would want to get people, and this is probably a high baller, really. I would want to try and get Kalia's husband on because everyone knows he's one of the most talked about athletes in the world. And I would want to get his opinion on why isn't Kalia being talked enough? Why is ESPN, Fox News, not Fox News, Fox Sports, and CBS Sports, why are they refusing to talk about the NWSL, WNBA, the Professional Hockey Federation for the women's league? Like, why aren't they? Because there's two sides to every story. And I think it's important for listeners like you, other podcasts, to see his side.
Of course, with obviously the PHF coming out just this week about having them be nationally on ESPN, what are your input on having them be on ESPN and broadcast nationally?
Oh, I just learned that right now, and I say good job ESPN, because prior to hearing that news, the WNBA was also has a deal with ESPN, and I think it's important, the more ESPN is willing to broadcast women's sports, the more like Kaylee, Julie Ertz, all Ali Kruger, Ashlyn Harris, those are some big players. Those leagues will be more paid attention to, and then people won't have to rely on women's sports podcasts to learn the news.
What is something that you learned now that you didn't know before covering women's sports?
So, are you talking about anything in general?
Yes.
Okay. One thing I learned that I didn't know is that having a podcast is like a second job and a full-time job, because I had just did it when I was a senior in college. Didn't really have a lot of time to do it, but now that I'm graduated, I'm really taking the time to focus because we, like, you know this because you're doing all these interviews. We work our butts off to get guests to come up with questions to make sure our interviewees are happy with our time, and then promoting it is also a lot, but it's all worthwhile doing when we get downloads and listener counts.
What are some of your future plans with All Women's Sports Matters podcast?
So my plan with All Women Sports podcast is, good question. I'm really hoping to get as many guests on my podcast as I can. And I saw your video with the Women's Sports Matter podcast a few weeks ago. I listen to hers all the time and I absolutely love it. And can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
What are some of your future plans with your podcasts?
Okay, so my future plans are getting as many guests on and trying my best to get my podcast known to everyone, because the more you put it, the more listens you get, the more you put it out there, the more people are willing to listen and at least willing to watch one of the women's leagues play. And I'm hoping, like I've mentioned ESPN quite a few times throughout this interview, I'm hoping one day they hear an episode of my podcast and say, oh, we need to have a whole show or at least one segment dedicated to women's sports in our shows. That would be the biggest dream of all.
What advice would you give people looking to get into sports podcasts talking about women's sports and women getting into sports podcasts in general?
So I'm going to be brutally honest. That's the kind of person I am. It's not going to be easy when you first start out. That's what I learned the hard way, is I didn't do enough research. But I've also followed some other podcasts where I will ask them questions like, how do you secure guests? How do you do this? What's the best platform to use? And so don't be afraid to reach out. And as long as you put in the time and equity into promoting your podcast, the sky's the limit for anyone.
That's wonderful. Where can my listeners find you at on social media?
So my podcast is sorry, give me a second. Is the Twitter is All Women Sports, and my Instagram is also All Women Sports Podcast. Oh, one sec. The Twitter's All Women Sports 1.
That's wonderful. Thank you again, Lindsay Smith, for your interview, and best of luck in your future with All Women's Sports Matters podcast.
Thank you.
You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Facebook at Brandon Sports Talk, Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Lindsay Smith, for your interview, and best of luck in your future with All Women's Sports Matters podcast.
Thank you.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, Share and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media and on YouTube.